what are the biggest challenges in the U.S.? You know, there are a lot. There are a lot of challenges here. I think we tend to lose perspective because we always, you always hear politicians talk about being a beacon for the rest of the world and America being the exceptional, right? The American exceptionalism. I think we need to refrain from using those type of statements. I think we really need to embrace what it means to be a humble nation, not an arrogant nation anymore. I don't think we have the right to do it anymore. I think we have a lot of challenges. I still think we're I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. Let me make that very clear. But that doesn't mean we cannot embrace the rest of society. It doesn't mean we cannot embrace issues of human rights with humility. An example of this is recently the Convention on the Rights of the Disabled Person rejected in the House, right? And if you look at the rationale, forget if you're Democratic, Republican, it doesn't matter. Look at the rationale given by those who did not approve the measure. Like, who would oppose a convention to protect the rights of disabled persons? This is a convention that is signed by over, I think, 120, 30 nations already. And we're one of the few nations, at least the few powerhouse nations, that have not signed on to this treaty. Now, how can that be? And so this idea of American exceptionalism is getting in the way of basic human rights that need to be passed in this country. And the funny thing is, we are the ones who champion. Our stamp is all over CRPD, which is the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities. We have led the way for many treaties all over the world and conventions that protect human rights, yet we're not signatories to many of them because of this idea that why do we need to sign on to something when we have the greatest laws in the world? Well, yes, we may, but by signing on and having and ratifying these treaties, we also signal to the rest of the global community that we are a part of you, that we are not separate from you. We have nothing to hide, and our laws and our policies are in. So there's nothing for us to fear. So there's a big divide in that, and so it's not just CRPD, but also CEDAW, the Convention on Women, has also not been passed. Also, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has not been passed. I think we are one of, I think, only nation in the world except for Somalia, which doesn't have a functioning government, that hasn't signed that treaty. So there are some major issues in terms of recognizing that international law is not the enemy for the U.S., that it's actually something that will make us part of the greater community, global community. Now, in terms of specific issues that I see, there's a lot of structural discrimination issues, and since you've talked about women's rights, let me talk about some very simple things that you don't see. And this will get into what structural discrimination means. So why are we focusing on, why do we call this structural discrimination? Why is this any different than discrimination? Well, structural discrimination hits at points that are embedded in laws, in policy, and in case law, right? These are things that often have a neutral appearance, but have a very detrimental impact to vulnerable communities, especially minority communities. Because as you know, laws are often shaped by the majority. And oftentimes they may there is the Family Leave Act, right? So Family Leave Act, in many countries, especially European countries, you have paid leave. In this country, you don't. You have 12 weeks of leave, not necessarily paid. But what does that do, right? It puts women in a very tenuous position of what they should do in their careers, right? Should they take the leave and spend that time recovering and being there with their child? But they can't afford to do so. Even if they can afford to do so, does that jeopardize their job and their position? Right? So there's many holes in laws and policies that are not protective of women and minorities. And that's just one example of a structural issue that perpetuates this idea that, in a sense, women cannot rise, let's say, the corporate ladder, and still perpetuates this idea of this paternalistic society. So that's one issue. In terms of a very serious issue, look, Guantanamo is still not closed, and this was promised by President Obama when he came into office in 2008. But to me, I wrote a paper on something that I felt was even more, in a sense, egregious, something that kind of shocks the conscience. And right now in Guantanamo, there are dozens of individuals who were captured and have been there for over 10 years. They are not charged. They were picked up in Afghanistan because they happened to be there, because the U.S. government had given certain, bounties to the Northern Alliance, basically $5,000 a head for every insurgent you can pick up. And basically the Northern Alliance picked up people who were not necessarily part of their, clan, people they had grudges against, people that had nothing to do with the acts of 9/11. These people got transferred to Guantanamo. And let me specifically give you who I'm talking about. One group is I'm talking about the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are Chinese Muslims that have been persecuted in China, and they were in Afghanistan training, but their gripe is only against China. They have nothing to do with the U.S., but they were picked up, detained, and in the U.S. Camp for over 10 years, some of them. Now, the U.S. has designated them as not enemy combatants, yet they still haven't been released. Why is that? When they initially brought them in, said they were terrorists, and now when they've said they're not terrorists, nor are they enemy combatants, but now they're trying to send them back, where are they going to send them back? If they send them back to China, they'll be executed, so they can't go to their homeland. No other country wants them, because once you've been terrorists, you can't really take the label off and suddenly everyone's like, oh, that's fine, no problem, they're not terrorists anymore. So no country wants them. So do they integrate them into the United States, or do they leave them there in Guantanamo indefinitely for the rest of their lives? And currently, if they cannot be relocated to another country, and oftentimes the U.S. is looking at small islands that they can give tons of money to and relief to and other things to take on these individuals. If they can't be relocated, they are stuck in Guantanamo indefinitely, meaning indefinite detention means they could potentially serve the rest of their lives at Guantanamo for never committing an act against the U.S., for not being charged as a terrorist or an enemy combatant, for no other reason than they were accidentally picked up and brought to Guantanamo. So when you talk about the height of egregiousness and the fact that this can happen in the U.S., this is happening in the U.S. And I'm sorry for the long response, but I thought that's an important thing that should be pointed out, because it's been so long, and oftentimes people think that these issues are done with and they're over, but the remnants of this still exist, and we still have a lot to do on that front. Thank you.